Hello again. My name is Don Simpson, and once again I'm wanting to share some stories from my global odyssey, in which for over 50 years I've been searching the world looking for ideas, individuals, and best practices that might help us understand a better approach for promoting cross-cultural harmony and for driving high performance in individuals and organizations. So I've been sharing some stories from one of the 15 logbooks from my global odyssey, and tonight we're at the second last excerpt from logbook 3, which has been looking at the connections with the African diaspora in Canada and my journey to come to grips with the roots of racism. So the theme for excerpt 22 tonight is cross-cultural conflict in the academic community. And I'd like to start with a couple of paragraphs written by Dudu Dian, the director of Intercultural Dialogue for UNESCO. He's providing the introduction to a book called African Wisdom, and he writes as follows. The prevailing clamor would have us hear only the siren voices that speak the language of power, the end of history, materialism, and the struggle for domination. These are the criteria by which Africa tends to be viewed and described. But as Africa's venerable sages observed of the colonial visitor, the white man, the European that is, sees only what he already knows. And so this book on African wisdom takes us back to the roots that embrace, exposing us to what we do not already know, and providing the murmuring of deep hidden waters. Dian's historical reference above to the European who sees only what he already knows resonates with one of the early aphorisms we've used in our innovation expedition group. Because we took the old saying that you no doubt know, I'm from Missouri, and I'll only believe it when I see it. And we turned it on its head, suggesting that as we move out of our familiar cultural environment, the more accurate statement might be, I will not see it until I believe it. Because our personal perceptions shaped by our cultural upbringing and our early life experiences dramatically shape how we view the world. And the way in which we view other parts of the world greatly influences the way in which we interact with those places and with those people. Thus, our group has always felt it important for our innovation expedition to help shape the attitude of Canadians to other parts of the world, particularly those with which they've had little interactions. Now, one of the priorities for me has been to gather and share stories out of Africa that might help Canadians rethink their perceptions of Africa and the potential implication of that continent's development for Canada. However, in moving to introduce third world cultural material into educational programs in my university and others, I tried to adopt an operating principle of positioning people from those cultures to present their stories. The message I'd been hearing from minority group leaders in this country and from other third world leaders was that if material on another culture is going to be collected and shared, then individuals from that culture should be deeply involved in the collection, analysis, and dissemination of such material. And this lesson was certainly driven home to me at the historic meeting in Montreal on African Studies in 1969. But just before I begin the story of that Montreal meeting, let me share another quote. This one's much more recent, October 2015, and it's from an announcement of an upcoming conference in the African Studies Association of Africa at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. The quote says, "History was made on October 25th, 2013, when Africanist scholars drawn from different parts of the African continent and beyond met at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana in Legon. They met to establish the African Studies Association of Africa to be domiciled on the African continent. This was a revolutionary decision, given the fact that before this historic event, all the existing African Studies associations in the world were located outside of Africa." And that's the lead into this 1969 meeting in Montreal. Because in October of that year, shortly after launching the Office of International Education at the University of Western Ontario, I headed to Montreal to attend my first formal academic conference on African Studies. The meeting was sponsored jointly by the African Studies Association of the United States, which had been established in 1957, and the Committee on African Studies in Canada, which had been in existence since 1962. Now, this was the first time the African Studies Association of the U.S. had met outside of the United States. And the choice of holding the event in a classy hotel, the Queen Elizabeth, and in a vibrant bilingual city was expected to produce the most lavish and enjoyable meeting of the ASA's 12-year history. Well, it did prove to be the most eventful and decisive meeting in the history of the ASA, but not in the manner intended by the organization. From the beginning, Black militants disrupted the proceedings, challenging the structure and composition of the association and questioning the moral base of African studies in America. What followed was 4 days of bitter political and racial confrontation that threatened the survival of the ASA. And in the passionate debates that followed the conference, the nature of African studies in North America was fundamentally altered. To set some clearer context, let me share excerpts from a report of that meeting by Jane Barfield Hayes, then professor of government in the University of Toronto. Her report was carried in the December '69 issue of Africa Report, which at that time was an American-based publication. She writes, "At the opening plenary session on Wednesday, October the 15th, a group of Black American students seized the microphone from the invited speaker, Gabriel Darboussier, the Senegalese ambassador to West Germany, and demanded that the ideological framework of the ASA, which perpetuates colonialism and neocolonialism through the educational institutions and the mass media, be changed immediately. They insisted that a new board of directors be chosen to be composed of 6 Africans and 6 Europeans, and that a committee composed of equal numbers of Africans and Europeans should establish the criteria for allocation of funds for research and publications. They also demanded that the ASA give financial support to a group of West Indian students from Sir George Williams University in Montreal, who were then in jail on charges of having caused extensive damage to a computer center after a racial incident involving a white professor in 1968. And those of you who have been following these excerpts know that we covered that story in an earlier excerpt. The militants in Montreal contended that all black people are African peoples and called for the suspension of the conference, the vacating of the ASA offices, so that black people can determine the future definition and content of African studies. The plenary session was adjourned, and the meeting dissolved into scores of heated discussions. And the board of the ASA decided not to call the Montreal police in order to what might have become a violent racial clash. Now, one of the men who were leading the takeover was a young Nigerian who had been involved in Crossroads Africa with me back in 1960. And I had bunked with him in a sleeping bag in a little village in Iamufu. And there we were building a new market center for that community. It was fascinating for me to go through the days at the conference, experiencing the threatened violence tactics of the militants to keep the meeting from functioning, and then to sit with my friend and some of his fellow protesters at night and talk about what was driving them, what they felt was wrong. It had a profound effect on me. And the responses I got from this Nigerian to my questions were clear and compelling. He explained that their intervention was intended not just to deliver a message of black self-assertion, but also to challenge the competence, the definition, the direction of research by white academics on Africa and on the African diaspora throughout the world. In Montreal, they were demonstrating a determination to change this situation by assuming control of the definition and nature of scholarly work on Africa. Part of their challenge to the white-run ASA was intellectual, and part was political. The protesters expressed concern on several fronts. For example, they challenged the position of white Africanists that African American studies and African studies are disconnected and have no direct connection with each other. They were angered that little credit was being given to black African authors such as Carter Woodson, Edward Blyden, Leo Hansberry, William Du Bois, and others. They were annoyed that few white Africanists have had exposure to the wonderful Schomburg collection in Harlem and similar African collections at Howard, Fisk, and Atlanta University. And they noted that the lives of such notable black leaders as William Brown, Timothy Fortune, Langston Hughes, Martin Delany, and others were rarely footnoted in any white scholarship. Many went on to express concern that white African scholarship was often the handmaiden of Western industrial and political international interests. They noted that the ASA was financially supported by corporate groups who maintained colonial investments in Africa. And hearing all of these issues, I indicated to my Nigerian friend that I felt many of the 1,700 attendees at the conference would in fact be sympathetic to their demands. So I made the point, should they not stop the disruptions and engage in conversation with such potential supporters? His answer was an interesting one. He said that the one main operating rule of their protest team was absolutely no conversation with potential supporters. Their feeling was that white liberals are very good at talking, but not so good at acting. And if the militants stopped their interruptions in order to talk, the event would soon be over and nothing really would have changed. So they were committed to changing the control of the ASA And their tactics succeeded because they had a clear strategy for bringing about major changes. Now, the annual general meeting, which at most ASA conferences was somewhat routine, became a high point of tension in Montreal. Only the fully accredited fellows of the African Studies Association, which represented a small minority of the attendees, were officially, according to the Constitution, allowed to vote. However, at this conference, a large crowd of delegates pushed their way into the AGM, and the newly formed Black Caucus forced its will on the session. The militants presented 5 points to this restructured annual general meeting. The Canadian African Studies Committee and the ASA should make clear their opposition to colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism. We should acknowledge that the Black Revolution in Africa and in America represents the vanguard of the Black Revolution globally. Third, a political economic study of the ASA and the CASC must be undertaken in the wider context of organizations and institutions involved in Africa. Fourth, the ASA must be transformed so as to serve rather than impede the liberation of Black peoples. And finally, they demanded the full and immediate democratization of the ASA. Now, in the ballroom where the AGM was taking place, we experienced a bewildering maze of motions, amendments, and parliamentary points of order. In some votes, bully tactics were used to support some of the proposals by the Black Caucus. The caucus, however, narrowly lost their move to immediately get the fellows to provide racial parity on the board. And this led to a walkout of the Black Caucus supported by a small but articulate group of white supporters. At that point, Professor Fred Burke of the State University of New York at Buffalo, speaking on behalf of a group of concerned white liberals, proposed a compromise motion for appointment of a 30-member interim constitutional committee, half of whose members would be Black, and who would be asked to draft a new constitution for the ASA. The ASA fellows passed this motion by a large majority, and the conference returned to a note of normalcy for the closing Friday night dinner. Now, in the months that followed the Montreal events, the debate continued in the journals of the ASA and in other publications on Africa. Some academics saw it as an important maturation stage in African studies, and for those professors, they would say it's time to discard our Western values hiding in the pseudo-intellectual guise of objectivity, and we should take on African values so we may see their objectives more clearly. But many academics, white and Black, were appalled by the actions taken as a response to the arrival of the Black militants at an academic gathering. Pierre Vanderberg, who described himself as an African American, I believe he was likely from South Africa, wrote the following: "By a clever combination of intimidation and playing on the racial guilt of white American members of the association, a small, totally unrepresented group of racists succeeded in imposing on the association a racial definition of the situation. And they succeeded in stampeding a flock of bewildered, self-styled liberals into accepting the principle of apartheid within the association. The fundamental need of the ASA was to Africanize the association, not to racialize it. It chose the latter, and by doing so became less African and more American than it was before. And that's the end of Vanderburg's piece. This kind of dialogue continued for many months in the media and in academic meetings, and for a time the issue of academic African studies occupied a significant place in educational circles. Adrian Resnick, in an article entitled "The Future of African Studies After Montreal," suggested that African studies in the United States was suffering from the four following critical areas of failure. Widespread connection with the U.S. government is number one. For example, the United States Agency for International Development and the CIA have used African studies programs to train their people and have subcontracted programs to those university institutions. And Title IV defense contractors provided much of the funds for creating large African studies programs at American universities in the 60s. Their second area of failure was that African studies is producing scholars who are replicas of their teachers, and that drastic departures from accepted ways of thinking about Africa are regarded as incorrect and unscholarly. Thus, any student with vague notions about exploring class exploitation and imperialism is not encouraged to develop these ideas. The third area was that Africanists tend to view Africa through Western eyes, and U.S. scholars tend to approach their work from the point of view of America's interests rather than Africa's. And finally, they argued that African studies and the ASA in particular have failed to actively oppose colonialism and imperialism in Africa. Now, all these driving principles were turned upside down by the historic Montreal meeting. African studies in North America was fundamentally altered by what happened in those sessions. The experience had a profound effect on me and served to reinforce some of the approaches to cross-cultural education that I was about to help introduce at the University of Western Ontario through the Office of International Education and its important spin-off, the Cross-Cultural Learner Centre. Many Canadians in attendance at the Montreal Conference were concerned about our own cultural and linguistic challenges in Canada. They were certainly sobered by the virulence of the American racial virus, even in that academic setting. And I think they recognized that racial differences in Canada, while significant, were less divisive than in the United States. During the Montreal session, the Canadian Committee on African Studies withdrew its support for the meeting and held its own annual business meeting separately and without interruption. The initial call to organize resulted from discussions between Dr. J. Roby Kidd, Executive Secretary of the Social Science Research Council, and later to become my mentor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. And he was assisted by Ron Cohen, Professor of Anthropology at McGill, who was one of my earlier colleagues in the creation of the African Students Foundation. And lacking the financial support given by the U.S. government to its universities for African studies, the Canadian Committee had been making slow progress since its founding in building an academic base for African studies in Canada. The committee had published first a bulletin, then later a journal on African studies with leadership coming from Donald Savage at Loyola University. In Canada, small inputs, mostly courses on African studies rather than programs, began to emerge at over a dozen universities across the country. These were led by individual professors who had a personal commitment to African studies. Many from these institutions were in attendance at the Montreal meeting and were no doubt impacted strongly by the events. In any case, one outcome was the transformation of the Canadian Committee in 1970 into the Canadian Association of African Studies, which, as many of you will know, in 2010 celebrated 40 years of existence. As for the larger global discipline of African studies, the struggle to define appropriate principles has been going on. Scholarly activists from Africa continued to underscore the challenges faced by many scholars who were based in Africa. They highlighted the uphill task for African scholars to attend the conferences of these African Studies associations in North America and Europe, to say nothing of their little or no control over the direction of the discourse taken at such conferences, especially those relating to the perception of the peoples on the continents. So these African-based academics are the ones who spoke of history being made on October 25th, 2013, when Africanist scholars from different parts of the continent met in Ghana to establish the African Studies Association of Africa, domiciled on the African continent. This was seen as a positive response by Africans on the continent to the clarion call for change by many African leaders and by the activists whom I met with in Montreal in 1969. As a related sequence of events to the end of the 60s and that meeting in Montreal, I want to talk about 1968, which became the year of global revolts. And I want to look a bit at their influence on Canada. To me, the 60s in Canada was a shift period. Those of us who were young university grads at that time were part of a somewhat conservative, tradition-oriented generation that was deeply influenced by the economic depression of the 30s and by World War II. These two major events shaped our thinking and our actions towards others throughout the world. But our generation was followed by the boomer generation, which was in a totally different mind space. A fundamental shift then was building throughout the world during the 1960s. In Africa, for example, the drive for independence had moved to a new high level of activity as colonies gained their independence. In Europe, much of the anger towards authoritarian conservative leadership took as its focus a drive to end the Vietnam War and to promote efforts for increased students' rights. In the United States, the next phase in the battle for civil rights for blacks had begun and was intertwined with anti-war protests and with groups pushing for freer speech and increased student rights at universities. And somehow in 1968, the anger, frustration, and demand for change that had been bubbling throughout the 60s burst into the open. There were major riots in big cities and the burning of buildings. Politicians and police in most major American cities were behaving as if they were preparing for war. The city administration in Detroit, for example, was buying tanks and helicopters to protect the community against the rioters in the Black Ghetto. And into that setting, the Black Power movement arrived. And I think it's appropriate to say in the 60s, Negroes became blacks. In one of my initial presentations in the Buxton Church in 1962 that wonderful community that I've talked to you about, created by runaway slaves in the middle of the 19th century. Speaking in the 1960s in that community, I was using the term Negro and was challenged by an elderly person in the audience who argued that I should refer to him not as a Negro, but as a colored person. These arguments were left behind in the 60s, as fairly rapidly the appropriate description became black. Up to this point, black was a seldom used poetic terminology. In the period 1966 to 68, the term started to be applied to black militants and became a rallying cry for communities demanding change. Negro became a pejorative term for those who were now seen as not ready to take on the power of being black. And what we began to see in this period is a growing split between some American communities following Gandhi's model of nonviolent protest. Mostly this was led by Southern black leadership, who were starting to be challenged by urban black leaders out of big northern cities. For example, someone like Stokely Carmichael of New York, who was looking to the Mau Mau model in Kenya. And so this led to a growing civil rights clash between the followers of Martin Luther King, focusing on freedom now, and the followers of Carmichael pushing for black power. Why did this happen in the late 60s? The boomer generation had become so alienated that they came close to rejecting all authority. The Vietnam War was so universally hated around the world that it provided a cause for any rebels looking for a cause. Remember, TV for the first time was having a dramatic influence on public attitudes. CBC TV had just begun in 1952, and war was for the first time being seen on TV through videotapes, as were many of the protests. So, what kind of impact did these late 60s events have on my personal global odyssey? Well, events such as Africville, the Sir George Williams affair, the African Studies meeting in Montreal, and the student actions of the new Black Power movement had a strong impact on my thinking. And the arrival of Black Power advocates in the community of Buxton led for a brief time to an attack on my personal intentions. I found myself being described as a modern-day carpetbagger seeking to make my fortune by exploiting the history of that black community. It was a harsh blow to me, and I remember being both hurt and angry, since my perspective was that I had been functioning as a sensitive supporter of their community dream, and I had been functioning as a volunteer supporter. Fortunately for me, Dorothy Shreves, one of the leaders of the museum committee in Buxton that I was working with, was in St. Joseph's Hospital in London at the time when the attacks on me first surfaced. And when I visited her, I got sound advice. She told me to ignore the criticisms and the taunts and just keep working on my badly needed research. She suggested that I should stay away from the community for a brief period and give the people the opportunity to work through this new challenge. She said the anger being stirred up by the Black Power advocates would not become embedded in their community because it was not in line with their instinctive values. And she was right. And I had the wonderful opportunity of reflecting on this period in Buxton's history and on my history when I sat near Dorothy at the Buxton Labor Day celebration in 2007. Dorothy was then 98 years of age. All of these events stimulated my commitment to explore the pseudoscience of race based on biology and the use of intelligence testing as a favored basis for applying this pseudoscience and the elements and conditions that have sustained white racism against blacks as arguably the most forceful and dominant application of this pseudoscience. I found myself experiencing personal anger whenever I was informed about or exposed to another blatant example of discrimination of whites towards people of color, particularly blacks and aboriginals. And I experienced a hunger to learn all that I could about the historical basis of anti-black racism globally, and specifically about its roots in Canada, particularly its impact on government policies. I became eager to understand what lay behind the resilience of these racial ideas, which one would have hoped would have been recognized by now as having no basis in anything more than personal fears and animosities. This journey, not surprisingly, also led me into the complex world of black responses to white prejudice and to the emergence of a variety of forms of black nationalism and black power ideologies. So, in the next and last excerpt to this logbook, I want to try to dig further into these ideas about race. Let the journey continue.